The betrayal didn't come from across a border. It came from inside the room where war was being planned. While the world watched Burkina Faso fight jihadists, a senior military official was feeding classified intelligence directly to Western operatives. Troop locations, arms deals, internal strategies, everything. President Ibrahim Traoré knew. But instead of arresting him, he did something no one expected. He turned him into a weapon. For months, false intelligence flowed back to Europe and America. They thought they controlled Burkina Faso. They were wrong. And when Traoré finally revealed what he'd done, it didn't just expose a spy. It exposed how modern coups actually work. In late 2025, intelligence began flowing out of Burkina Faso's presidential compound in Ouagadougou. Not through hacked servers or intercepted communications, but through a human channel. Someone with direct access to military briefings, strategic planning sessions, and classified coordination with Mali and Niger was feeding information to Western intelligence operatives. The leaks were precise. Troop movements along the northern frontier, arms procurement schedules, even the internal debates over whether to fully expel French military advisors still embedded in regional coordination structures. This wasn't espionage from a distance. This was a controlled demolition from within. President Ibrahim Traoré, who came to power in September 2022 through a military coup fueled by public frustration over jihadist violence and perceived neo-colonial interference, now faced a threat no coup could solve. The enemy wasn't wearing a uniform. The enemy was wearing his. For months, Burkina Faso had been tightening its posture. Alongside Mali and Niger, it had formed the Alliance of Sahel States, a confederation designed to assert sovereignty, reduce dependence on Western military frameworks like ECOWAS, and recalibrate security strategies around homegrown solutions. France, which had dominated the region's security architecture for decades, was being systematically edged out. American drone operations were being scrutinized. The message was clear: the Sahel was reclaiming control. But reclaiming control requires trust. And trust in Traoré's inner circle had been weaponized. The leaks weren't just embarrassing. They were operationally dangerous. When intelligence on counterterrorism raids reached foreign hands before they reached field commanders, the results were predictable. Ambushes, failed operations, a growing sense among the military rank and file that their leadership was either incompetent or compromised. Traoré couldn't afford either perception. His legitimacy rested on the promise of sovereignty and security. If he couldn't secure his own command structure, how could he secure the nation? This is where the stakes become existential. Because the betrayal wasn't just about information. It was about influence. Whoever was feeding intelligence to Western operatives wasn't just leaking, they were shaping how external actors understood Burkina Faso's vulnerabilities, shaping which alliances could be disrupted, shaping the narrative that would justify future interventions, sanctions, or diplomatic isolation. The insider wasn't just a spy. They were a strategic asset in a larger game to destabilize the Sahel's push for autonomy. Traoré's response had to be surgical. A public purge would signal panic. It would fracture military cohesion at a time when Burkina Faso was fighting jihadist insurgencies on multiple fronts. It would hand propagandists in Paris and Washington a narrative of chaos and paranoia. So instead, Traoré went silent. Meetings became smaller. Information was compartmentalized. Loyalists were quietly rotated into sensitive positions. The investigation moved in shadows, tracing patterns, watching who reacted to which pieces of information, and waiting for the insider to make a mistake. This isn't just a story about one African nation rooting out a mole. It's a story about how modern coups don't always involve tanks in the streets. Sometimes they involve a trusted general, a leaked memo, and a phone call to Langley. It's about how sovereignty in the 21st century is tested not just by armies, but by the integrity of the people who hold power. And it's about how leaders like Traoré, who rose through revolutionary rhetoric and anti-imperialist sentiment, now face the harder task of governing in a world where betrayal is more effective than bullets. The arrest happened at dawn, but the investigation had been running for months. When President Ibrahim Traoré's security team detained a senior military official in early 2025, it was an impulse. It was the result of a counterintelligence operation conducted in complete silence. No leaks, no public accusations, no dramatic purges that would signal panic or fracture the command structure. Just surveillance, pattern analysis, and patience. Because in Burkina Faso's current geopolitical reality, where sovereignty is contested and foreign influence runs deep, reacting too quickly is as dangerous as doing nothing at all. The official in question had access to troop deployments along the volatile northern border, where jihadist insurgencies remain active. Access to procurement schedules for weapons sourced outside traditional Western channels. Access to internal discussions about Burkina Faso's deepening alignment with Mali and Niger through the Alliance of Sahel States, a confederation designed to reduce reliance on French military frameworks and ECOWAS structures that many in the region view as extensions of neo-colonial control. That access made him valuable, and that value made him a target. Western intelligence agencies have long maintained networks across the Sahel. France, through decades of military presence under operations like Barkhane and Serval, built relationships that didn't disappear when troops withdrew. The United States, through counterterrorism partnerships and drone operations, embedded itself into the region's security infrastructure. When leaders like Traoré began pushing back, those networks didn't dissolve. They adapted. And one of the ways they adapted was by cultivating sources inside the very governments trying to expel them. The intercepted communications were precise. Encrypted messages passing between the official and contacts in European capitals. Detailed briefings on internal debates over whether to fully terminate agreements with Western military advisors. Reports on which battalions were considered most loyal to Traoré and which might be susceptible to external pressure. This wasn't casual information sharing. This was operational intelligence being fed to entities with strategic interests in destabilizing Burkina Faso's push for autonomy. What happens next could redefine how African nations handle internal subversion in an era where coups are often facilitated not by tanks, but by information. Traoré faced a decision: detain and prosecute, which would expose the breach publicly and risk signaling vulnerability both domestically and internationally. Or use the traitor, turn him, make him a double agent feeding controlled information back to the same operatives who thought they had compromised Burkina Faso's leadership. The second option required precision. It required trust in a very small circle. And it required accepting that the game being played wasn't just about rooting out one mole, but about understanding the larger network, attempting to manipulate the Sahel's political trajectory. The decision was made. The official was flipped. Now, instead of intelligence flowing out unchecked, it flows strategically. Misinformation designed to obscure actual military operations. False timelines for diplomatic moves. Planted doubts about internal dissent that don't actually exist. The conspirators on the receiving end believe their asset is still operational. They're making decisions based on information they think is reliable. But it's not. And that gap between what they believe and what's real creates space for Traoré to maneuver without external interference. This is where the stakes become clear. Because this isn't just about one betrayal in one country. Across the Sahel, leaders who have come to power through promises of sovereignty and anti-imperialist rhetoric are discovering that the infrastructure of foreign influence doesn't leave just because the rhetoric changes. Mali's Assimi Goïta, Niger's Abdourahmane Tiani, and Traoré in Burkina Faso are all navigating the same challenge: how to govern independently when the systems they inherited were designed to keep them dependent. The double-agent strategy is high risk. If the deception is uncovered, it confirms to adversaries that Burkina Faso's counterintelligence is sophisticated enough to detect and manipulate foreign operations. That acknowledgement alone shifts the balance. It forces recalibration. It makes future penetration attempts more cautious, more resource-intensive, and less likely to succeed. But if the deception holds, Traoré gains something more valuable than security. He gains leverage, the ability to feed adversaries conclusions that serve Burkina Faso's interests, the ability to shape how external actors perceive threats, opportunities, and weaknesses in the region, the ability to fight a war that most people don't even know is happening. The false intelligence began flowing in 2025, and no one on the receiving end suspected a thing. Burkina Faso's counterintelligence apparatus, operating under President Ibrahim Traoré's direct oversight, had turned a compromised senior military official into a controlled channel. What Western intelligence agencies believed was a reliable asset feeding them real-time information from Ouagadougou was now a weapon pointed back at them. The game had shifted. Burkina Faso was no longer defending against infiltration. It was hunting. The misinformation was surgical. Fabricated troop movements along the northern frontier designed to suggest vulnerabilities that didn't exist. False timelines for arms procurement from Russian and Chinese suppliers, tailored to trigger premature responses from European diplomatic channels. Planted reports of internal dissent within the Alliance of Sahel States, the military confederation binding Burkina Faso with Mali and Niger in their push to reduce reliance on Western security frameworks. Every piece of false intelligence was crafted not just to deceive, but to provoke a reaction. And reactions reveal infrastructure. This is where the strategy becomes clinical. Because counterintelligence isn't just about stopping leaks. It's about mapping the network. Who receives the information? How quickly does it move? Which agencies prioritize which kinds of intelligence? Where are the decision-making nodes located? By controlling what the adversary believes, Burkina Faso's intelligence team could trace the flow of information across continents, identifying handlers, intermediaries, and the operational priorities of foreign agencies still embedded in the Sahel's political landscape. Within weeks, patterns emerged. Certain fabricated reports triggered immediate diplomatic activity in Paris. Others prompted adjustments in American drone surveillance patterns over the tri-border region where Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger converge. The false intelligence about internal rifts within the Alliance of Sahel States reached ECOWAS headquarters in Abuja faster than it reached European capitals, suggesting that some regional actors were also part of the information chain. The map of influence was becoming visible. What happens next could redefine how sovereignty is defended in the 21st century. Traoré's approach wasn't about exposing the network publicly. A dramatic reveal would satisfy domestic audiences, but alert every other operative still embedded in the region. Instead, the strategy was incremental dismantlement. Individuals identified through the intelligence flow were quietly reassigned, their access reduced without explanation. Diplomatic channels that reacted too quickly to planted information were fed increasingly useless or contradictory data, degrading their reliability. The goal wasn't to shut down foreign intelligence operations entirely. That's impossible in a region where French, American, and increasingly Chinese and Russian interests overlap and compete. The goal was to make those operations expensive, unreliable, and strategically ineffective. This quiet war carries implications far beyond Burkina Faso. Across the Sahel, leaders who came to power through coups justified by anti-imperialist sentiment are discovering that dismantling neo-colonial structures requires more than rhetoric. Mali expelled French forces, but still struggles with jihadist violence and questions about who controls mineral-rich northern territories. Niger terminated its security agreements with the United States and pivoted toward Russia. But economic isolation from ECOWAS and Western-backed sanctions threaten stability. Burkina Faso, under Traoré, is attempting a different model. Stay engaged enough to avoid total isolation, but build internal systems capable of detecting and neutralizing foreign manipulation. The double-agent operation is a test case. If it succeeds, it proves that African nations can operate sophisticated counterintelligence strategies without relying on external partners who often have conflicting interests. It demonstrates that the infrastructure of foreign influence, built over decades of military cooperation and economic dependency, can be systematically degraded through patience and precision rather than confrontation. But the risks are significant. If the deception is uncovered, it confirms to adversaries that Burkina Faso has the capacity to run complex intelligence operations, which could escalate foreign efforts to destabilize the government through other means: economic pressure, support for internal opposition, or amplification of existing security threats. If the operation succeeds but becomes public, it could provoke a backlash from Western governments that view such tactics as hostile acts rather than defensive measures. You'll see why this moment matters. Because in a region where coups are often blamed on instability and poor governance, Burkina Faso is demonstrating that sometimes the instability is engineered. And the only way to stop it is to control the information before it controls you. The question is whether this silent strategy can be sustained long enough to build the sovereignty Traoré promised, or whether the forces arrayed against that sovereignty will find another way in. President Ibrahim Traoré's government publicly revealed that it had dismantled a foreign-backed intelligence operation designed to destabilize Burkina Faso from within. The disclosure wasn't a panicked accusation or a defensive reaction. It was a calculated message. A senior military official had been arrested months earlier, flipped into a double agent, and used to feed false intelligence back to Western operatives who believed they still controlled the flow of information from Ouagadougou. The plot had been neutralized not through mass purges or public hysteria, but through patience, precision, and counterintelligence discipline. And now the world was being told exactly how it happened. The timing of the revelation matters. Burkina Faso didn't expose the operation while it was unfolding. It waited until the network had been mapped, key operatives identified, and the strategic value of the deception fully extracted. By the time the public announcement was made, the damage to foreign intelligence infrastructure in the Sahel was already done. Handlers had been compromised. Communication channels had been exposed. And the agencies that believed they had penetrated Burkina Faso's inner circle were now scrambling to assess how much of their intelligence over the past months had been manufactured. This is where the stakes become geopolitical theater. Because the exposure wasn't just about security. It was about narrative. For years, Western governments and media outlets have framed instability in the Sahel as the inevitable result of poor governance, military coups, and leaders unable to manage complex security environments. Traoré's revelation flipped that script. It suggested that some of the instability, some of the chaos, and some of the intelligence failures attributed to African governments were not failures at all. They were the result of external interference designed to justify continued foreign intervention. The response across the region was immediate. In Mali, where Assimi Goïta's government has faced similar accusations of being infiltrated by foreign operatives, officials publicly praised Burkina Faso's counterintelligence success. In Niger, where Abdourahmane Tiani terminated security agreements with the United States and expelled French military advisors, the revelation reinforced the narrative that Western partners were not neutral actors, but active participants in attempts to shape the region's political trajectory. The alliance of Sahel states, which binds these three nations in a confederation designed to assert sovereignty and reduce reliance on ECOWAS and Western security frameworks, now had a concrete example of why that sovereignty is contested. What happens next could redefine how African nations approach foreign partnerships. Traoré emerged from the episode not as a strongman suppressing dissent, but as a disciplined strategist who neutralized a threat without destabilizing his own government. That distinction matters. Across Africa, leaders who come to power through coups often struggle with legitimacy, both domestically and internationally. They're accused of authoritarianism, paranoia, and governing through force rather than strategy. Traoré's handling of the intelligence operation presented a counter-narrative. He didn't react impulsively. He didn't stage mass arrests or purge the military. He investigated quietly, turned the threat into an asset, and only went public once the operation had been fully dismantled. This approach is being studied, not just in the Sahel, but across the continent, where governments increasingly face hybrid threats that combine diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and covert intelligence operations designed to weaken leaders who challenge the post-colonial order. The exposure of the Burkina Faso plot offers a playbook: detect, control, exploit, then reveal. It demonstrates that African nations can operate sophisticated counterintelligence strategies without relying on external partners whose interests often conflict with national sovereignty. But the risks of going public are real. By confirming that Burkina Faso successfully ran a double-agent operation, Traoré has signaled to adversaries that future penetration attempts will be more difficult. That acknowledgement could escalate foreign efforts to destabilize the government through other means: economic isolation, support for internal opposition, or amplification of jihadist threats that continue to destabilize the northern regions. It could also provoke a backlash from Western governments that view the exposure as a deliberate provocation rather than a defensive measure. You'll see why this moment matters beyond Burkina Faso. Because the question isn't whether foreign powers will continue attempting to influence African politics. They will. The question is whether African governments can build the institutional capacity to detect, counter, and expose those attempts in ways that shift the balance of power. Traoré's gamble is that transparency, in this case, strengthens sovereignty rather than weakening it. That the cost of being seen as capable of defending against foreign manipulation is worth the increased scrutiny that comes with it. Whether that gamble pays off will determine not just Burkina Faso's trajectory, but whether the Sahel's push for independence can survive the invisible wars designed to stop it.